I think we can all agree that the Star Wars sequel trilogy is pretty horrible. I'm sure there's a small percentage of people who genuinely like those movies, but I'm not even kidding, I don't know if I've ever met a single person in real life or online that really likes the sequels. Maybe they exist, but I'm still searching. The real question of this whole thing is, why did the sequels fail? Why do so many people hate these movies? And I'm not even talking about the regular excuses that we all throw out, one major one being it was all Rian Johnson's fault. I'm talking about what is the deeper reason these movies actually failed. What was the actual mistake that doomed this trilogy from the very beginning? Don't take it from me, take it from George Lucas himself. George Lucas did an interview years ago where he explained why the sequel trilogy was doomed from the start. And once you hear what he says and his mindset behind making movies, the sequel trilogy failure makes a lot more sense. To get a good understanding of all this, we have to go back to the very beginning. So George starts the interview by explaining how the Disney sale even happened in the first place.
You know, I made the decision to sell the company with Star Wars. I made that decision because I looked at the future. I looked at the fact that I was going to have a baby. I looked at the fact that I was married. And I looked at the fact that I wanted to build a museum. And I looked at the fact that I wanted to make experimental films.
And while he's explaining all that, he also admits something most people forget.
So my life was going on a different track. I noticed the last few movies that I'd made were costing the company a lot of money. And I didn't think that was fair to the people that worked there or the company.
Then he makes it clear that even before the Disney deal officially happened, he was already planning ahead for the future of Star Wars.
I had made a decision to move ahead on the next Star Wars series, and we were starting to do that.
So before Disney even fully takes over, George is saying that he was already moving forward on the next set of Star Wars movies, like it was really happening. And then he explains that they were already working on the actual writing side of it too, but things weren't really going perfectly.
So you were starting to make the next Star Wars.
Yeah. So, and we were working with a writer. It wasn't quite working out, but I was also, stepping away a little bit and turning things over to Kathy Kennedy.
So at this point, George is already stepping back a little and Kathy Kennedy is starting to take on more control behind the scenes. And then George explains that this is when Disney officially enters the picture, because Bob Iger straight up approaches him about buying Lucasfilm.
What happened was Disney said, Bob Iger said, if you really want to sell your company, if you're thinking about selling it, because we were talking about retirement and what are you going to do after all this kind of stuff. And he said, well, if you really want to sell it, we're very interested.
So after Bob Iger says Disney is interested, George ends up selling Lucasfilm to them, and then right after that, he says something in this interview that completely changes how you look at the sequel trilogy, because he makes it clear that when the sale happened, it wasn't like Star Wars was starting from scratch. They already had stuff being developed, they already had a direction, and George explains it himself.
So that started that ball rolling. And I had the story treatments or, outlines, and we were working on scripts. And
so that proves one thing. The sequel trilogy didn't start from nothing. There were treatments, there were outlines, and there were early scripts being worked on, which is a little weird because I remember Kathleen Kennedy saying this.
Well, actually, George Lucas never wrote a script for 7, 8, or 9.
Good old Kathleen Kennedy right there. But let's move on. This is where George basically explains the mindset difference that, in my opinion, ended up haunting the entire sequel trilogy. Because George says Disney was nervous going into episode 7. He talks about how Star Wars already had a messy history behind the scenes, even with the original movies.
And Disney, who was a little nervous, there's one of the issues was the first 3 movies had all kinds of issues.
And then he says what their mindset was when they looked at his story ideas.
They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans.
I'm not gonna lie, on paper, that does sound like a good idea. Obviously you want people to enjoy the movie, but George explains that his goal was different. He wasn't trying to make something that would get the best reaction in that moment. He was trying to tell the next part of the story.
So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened it started here and it went there.
And then he says something that I think is the most important line in this entire interview, because he explains what Star Wars has always been about to him.
It's all about generations, and it's about, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera. I mean, ultimately. I mean, we call it space opera, but people don't realize it's actually a soap opera. And it's all about family problems and it's not about spaceships.
So you can already see the difference right there. George is thinking long-term, generational storytelling. Disney's thinking we have to win the fan base back. And once that mindset takes over, you start playing things really safe. You start leaning really familiar. You start trying to please everybody. And when that becomes the goal, that's when you stop taking real risk. And then George explains what happened next. He says Disney didn't want to use his stories.
So they decided they didn't want to use those stories. They decided they were going to go do their own thing, and so I decided, fine.
And honestly, that one decision explains so much, because if George had treatments, outlines, and scripts, and Disney chooses not to use them, that's the exact moment where the sequel trilogy loses the chance to feel like one connected story from the very beginning. And George even admits he knew it was better for him to just step away at that point, because if he stayed involved, it would have turned into a constant fight.
But basically, I'm not going to try to... They weren't that keen to have me involved anyway, but at the same time I said, I'm not going to... If I get in there, I'm just going to cause trouble, because they're not going to do what I want them to do. So, and I don't have the control to do that anymore, and all I would do is muck everything up. So I said, okay, I will go my way, and I'll let them go their way.
So when George says Disney wanted to make something for the fans, you can instantly see what that turns into, because The Force Awakens was successful for 1 to 2 reasons. First, it felt familiar, it felt like the original trilogy, it felt like classic Star Wars again, and for a lot of people at that time, that's exactly what they wanted. And also, it was successful because Star Wars was finally back, similar to what happened with The Phantom Menace. But George makes it clear that wasn't how he made Star Wars. He didn't want retro movies. He wanted each trilogy to feel like it was moving forward into something different.
They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different, and make them completely different with, different planets, with different spaceships, with different, to make it new.
So are you at peace with this?
And that's basically the crossroads right there. George's mindset was tell the story and make something new. Disney mindset was make something familiar, win people back, and make money. And that's why the sequel trilogy starts off playing it very safe. Then halfway through, it switches directions completely. Episode 7 is fan service and nostalgia, people kind of complain about that, so episode 8 tries to go and do something completely different. But the issue is, it was too different. Keeping it familiar and making it different can coexist at the same time. You branch off and you make new stories, but you build off of what started before it, hence keeping it familiar. So after the backlash of The Last Jedi, episode 9 swings back in and tries to fix everything, but keeping it really familiar at the same time, bringing Palpatine back. And when the trilogy is pulled in different directions like that, it stops feeling like one story. So when you take everything that George says in this interview, it really comes down to one simple reason of why the sequels failed. Disney was focused on making Star Wars for the fans, instead of making Star Wars as a full story with one clear direction. And that's why the sequel trilogy is terrible. Not because Star Wars fans are impossible to please, but because the trilogy never fully committed to one good plan. So I want to know what you think. Do you agree with George Lucas's philosophy on making movies, telling the story no matter what the fans think, telling your story that goes with everything else? Or do you think Star Wars should always build around what the fans want and making money? Drop your takes down in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does help push the video out, and you know what you need to do. You need to subscribe. Do it.